yesterday, late afternoon, we heard the news that for the third time in a week, Russian military assets had made an incursion into NATO airspace. There was the famous one of the 20-plus drones that flew into Poland, some of which crashed, some of which were shot down by NATO assets. Then there was the incursion into Romanian airspace. And then yesterday afternoon, for 12 minutes, 3 F-31 MiG fighter jets roamed around Estonian airspace in the Baltic republics, of course, former parts of the Soviet Union. And this has led the Estonian government to invoke Article 4 of the NATO Charter, which means that, it's not like Article 5 where it's one for all and all for one in terms of defense, but they are discussing the seriousness of this issue, in a forum, I think, that is taking place this morning. So the Russians are clearly trying it on. What do we do about it? And what will they try next? Let's speak to Lord John Hutton, Labour peer and former Defence Secretary and former Chair of RUSI, the defence think tank. Good morning, John. How are you?
Yeah, good morning, Matt. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks.
Good. So how serious was this latest incursion? And it does look like a pattern now, doesn't it?
I think it is quite serious, and I think we should certainly take it seriously. It's a bit like how, you need to respond to a bully in the playground. You just don't stand there and take it. You've got to have a proper response. And I think for the bully, Putin in this case, I think we should send a very clear signal to him. For example, if there were to be any more of these incursions, then we will seize all of those assets owned by Russian companies and government that we have in European banks that have been frozen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's got to be a consequence for the Russians for continuing to flout NATO airspace. No one wants to go to war over anything like this, of course not. But I think equally, we've got to send a very clear signal to the Russians that this provocative behaviour is not going to go without consequence.
But how many more months or years do we have to wait before that signal is sent? We've been speaking about this from the very beginning, and we've always been giving the Ukrainians just enough not to sink, but not enough to actually prevail. And the same thing with the Russian assets. I think $320 billion worth of them. That's a lot of money, frozen in Western accounts. It's kept there, but it's not being used to rebuild or arm Ukraine. We've been talking about this endlessly. And even, despite the words said by Keir Starmer to Donald Trump at Chequers a few days ago, and, Trump sounded very upset with Putin and said that he had personally felt let down by him. But have we heard anything from the White House about this incursion? I don't think so.
No, I think that is a serious problem for us. I think the United States administration under President Trump hasn't been clear or consistent about how it deals with Putin and the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And ultimately, yes, Matt, we've got to get our lines straight with our American allies about how we're going to deal with that. So I think this is one of the many pieces of this jigsaw that have to come together if we're going to really respond properly to what the Russians are trying to do. But I think this would hurt them. If we were to seize those assets, it would hurt them very, very much indeed, particularly if we were then to go the extra step and give that money to Ukraine so it can continue to rearm and deal with the war in Ukraine in a proper way. So I think there's got to be consequences. That's really what I'm saying, man.
But
Russia can't go on like this and keep poking a red-hot poker in our face and expect us to do nothing. We are going to do something, and we've got to come together to do that. And perhaps when the NATO Council meets on Tuesday to respond to this latest Russian provocation, this would be something that they talk about.
I mean, the other point that Trump makes is that why should America spend, hundreds of millions of dollars on Ukraine when there are European nations still buying Russian gas and oil through the back door, let alone China and India, who are the biggest clients now for Russian carbon energy. I mean, that's a fair point as well, isn't it? We have to be much tougher at imposing the sanctions that we rhetorically so underpin.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think President Trump's got a fair point. Just as he had a fair point about the lack of many European NATO members to pay properly for the defence of NATO. And I think that is beginning to turn. So that is a success for President Trump. But I think we've got to get a consistent message clear amongst the NATO allies about the Russian aggression in Ukraine and what we're going to do about it and how we're going to allow Ukraine to defend itself properly in the future and what we do with these constant provocations from Russia, probing our willingness to stand together as an alliance. And if we don't stand together as an alliance, well, Putin's won a very significant victory. And you don't give the bully a chance to win. Well, you can if you want to, but we should all know what the consequence of that will be. He'll come after others, and then he'll come after someone else.
Right, and even though our economies combined just in the European Union are so much bigger, I mean, I think Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. We are, a continent. I know we're not part of the EU, but together with Britain, it's 550 million consumers. X trillion in GDP, an incredible arms industry, although it is fragmented over all these different nations, and they're often in competition with each other. We should be able to stand up to Putin the bully, as you've described it, but we seem to be incapable of doing so. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think to some extent, Matt, I think we're still sort of thinking along the lines, the old sort of tram lines of the Cold War. And I think, for example, in Britain, when it came to procuring a new main battle tank for the British Army, we thought we might have 10 to 15 years to plan that out and think about how it would work and so on. Well, we don't live in those times anymore. And I think we've really got to catch up with the new security threats to Europe, mainly coming from Russia. And that does require us. And I think the British government might have frightened people recently when it published its defence review, which said that we've got to think about getting onto a war footing. Well, we do. We've got to mobilise not just our own resources, but of all of our allies in Europe, so that we can respond more quickly. We can utilise the huge economic and military advantages we have over Russia as an alliance in a much more intelligent way than we've done so far. So when it comes to procurement, for example, we should think about how we can specialise, what we can do, what the Italians can do, what the Germans and French and others can do, and really pull together and maximise the leverage that we've got. And we've got a lot more leverage than sometimes we give us credit for. But we've really got to get ourselves into a frame of mind where we see the threat as imminent and we mobilise. And that is going to clearly require more spending on defence. I think all European countries, apart from Spain, have recognised that. And we've really got to move ahead with that, because we've got a narrow window here. We've got to strengthen our resolve, we've got to strengthen our defences, and we've got to give in future much clearer, sharper, harder messages to the bully Putin that we aren't going to put up with this kind of aggression.
I think the first time you said exactly those words on my programme was, I think, maybe a year and a half ago or so, and I think maybe you've said it since then, and they're still, very accurate, and still not enough has been done about it. Finally, and very briefly, I mean, as we have these abstract debates about very important issues, there are, real life consequences taking place with these incursions. Is it possible that one of these things will go horribly wrong one day, that a MiG jet will get shot down, the Russians then respond, and we're into a kind of a fairly rapid escalation and just not prepared for it?
Well, I mean, that's a doomsday scenario, Matt, but it's a real risk. And as long as Russian aircraft enter NATO airspace in the way they have been doing, those risks become that much more real. And absolutely no one wants to see that escalation. And, it is an old adage, but I think it is a perfectly appropriate one. If you want to prevent that from happening, then you've got to make sure you've got the means at your disposal to do so. And at the moment, we don't. And that's the simple choice and challenge we face. And I know it's taking far too long, I think, but I think we are getting into the zone where we can respond more effectively to Putin.